Welcome to another Mike Reads Reviews. Tonight we're going to be reviewing, as promised, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules to Life, an Antidote to Chaos. So, as we always do with our reviews, we start off with what the book is. And this is going to be the shortest part of the review, because what the book is a self-help book. There's no other way to describe it. It's nothing more. It's nothing less. I can't honestly describe this book or go into this review with a description or characterization of the book as anything other than a self-help book. Even the titled chapters read as a self-help book. Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule 2, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. So I don't think it was Peterson's intention for this book to be anything less or more than a self-help book, but that's where it is. And that's where this review is actually going to start, because this is going to cause it for me, in reflection on my personal taste, to have a ceiling in how highly I'm going to be able to rate this book. What do I mean by that? For me, by virtue of it being in the genre of self-help as a self-help book, I'm not going to be able to give it a 10 out of 10. And that isn't to say that it's not necessarily perfect within its own genre. It's to say that there are limitations of the genre, and based on my personal tastes, that may come from the standpoint of I consider myself fairly well adjusted, so I kind of don't need the self-help. And I've done a lot of study in psychology throughout the course of the years, and in my studies in college too. There were lots of actual psychology titled courses that I took, in addition to certain marketing courses like consumer behavior, or certain managerial courses like organizational behavior, where we wind up studying a lot of human behavior. We do a lot of psychological studies in those works. So I'd say in terms of like a study on psychology, that's only about 15% of this book's content. So if that's what you're looking for, you're probably not coming to the right place. And for me, it's not a lot of news. It may be a lot of news for people who aren't as familiar with the field of psychology as I am. So for me, it's just not something I'm that much interested in as a genre. So to explain what I mean by the ceiling, I think I'm going to have to use the analogy of a film. So there are certain genres in film for me that will never garner a 10 out of 10 because of the nature of the genre. And there are certain films that fall within a genre that will garner a perfect score for me when they normally wouldn't have, but that's because they transcend the genre. So let me give you the example of Predator versus Leon. So in this case, both movies are action movies. We know in the United States Leon as the professional. So in the case of Predator, it's just an action flick. There's nothing more to it than that. It is Alien versus Schwarzenegger, and Schwarzenegger's problems are resolved with punching, shooting, and explosions, right? But with Leon, you have the dynamicy of the characters of Matilda and Leon. Leon is a cold, robotic killing machine, and Matilda is a fragile, delicate, broken little girl, and she needs to mature. And he needs to, in order to become more human, he needs to become more human. He needs to learn how to laugh. He needs to learn how to love, even if it is a little girl as his daughter. She needs to understand the role of the father figure, because she never really had one. So in this case, Leon, or the professional, isn't just an action flick. It transcends the world of action, or the genre of action, to an entirely separate world. And what it does in doing so is it reveals insight about the nature of humanity, and it reveals insight about the human psyche. The same thing is true with the world of sci-fi. So if you're just a strict sci-fi movie, to me, that's a genre that I can't possibly give a 10 out of 10 to, unless you do something more than that. And in this case, the comparison would be Star Wars versus Close Encounters or Aliens. Aliens is a great action movie, which was set in the sci-fi setting. But we're not getting really any real insights into the human psyche with that movie. The same thing with Close Encounters. It's a neat and interesting movie. And both of these are movies I like, but they don't compare to Star Wars. In the case of the original trilogy, because I'm not acknowledging the prequel trilogy, and I'm definitely not acknowledging the somehow worse more recent Disney trilogy. In the case of the original trilogy, we barely had a sci-fi movie. In that trilogy, we have basically a space opera. It's an opera that happens to be set in some futuristic space age, if you will. It's a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But again, it's presenting basically a futuristic universe, if you will. And in that universe, Luke has to develop as a character. This is why, in my opinion, Empire, I'm willing to give a 10 out of 10 to, because the movie Empire transcends the genre and allows us to have serious insights into the human psyche. Luke is flawed. Leia and Han are flawed, but they eventually grow to love each other. And that love, that bond that they build, takes time, takes work, takes effort. It's built towards. It doesn't just happen. And Luke, when he goes through his training, we see all of his flaws. We see his weakness. And his fatal flaw is that when his friends are in need, instead of continuing his training like his senseis advise, instead of doing the thing that he needs to do to improve himself, he goes off and on a suicide mission to rescue his friends. And barely succeeds, and really only succeeds because Vader basically lets him. So in this case, we have a movie that goes way beyond just being lasers and laser swords and explosions in space and space age flybys, right? So there are genres in film that don't need to transcend their genre in order to garner a perfect score. Film noir, which a lot of the Alfred Hitchcock movies fall into. In fact, all of the great Alfred Hitchcock movies, and there are many of them, are revered because they allow insight into the human psyche. Shawshank it presents the conflict of hope between the representations of hope in the characters Andy Dufresne and Red, played by Morgan Freeman. The Godfather is the conflict of inevitability in the human psyche. If we're talking about television shows, I can go to one television show and compare one episode to the entire rest of the series. Futurama, love the series. Now I realize that's a little bit different with television because you're limited by the 22-minute time frame, right? But that show's funniest episode to me was Amazon Women in the Mood. But that episode to me, if I'm rating it, reviewing it as just good, is not as good as Jurassic Park, which I consider to be nowhere near as funny as Amazon Women in the Mood. But that soul-crushing ending at the end of Jurassic Park, which I won't spoil, and if you haven't seen it, folks, you got to see this episode, to me is what makes it the best episode. It transcends comedy. It transcends the 22-minute sitcom and just gut punches you at the end. And to me, that's what a great episode of a TV show will do. Not necessarily gut punch you, but affect you in a way that an episode normally wouldn't, because it, again, allows us insights into the human psyche. So now that we've talked about the notion of the ceilings within genres, now that we've talked about the genre itself and why this book is not going to garner a perfect score for me in this review, I hope you guys understand why that is, by the way. Let's talk about how the book fits within that genre. And in order to do that, I'm going to contrast that to another book in that genre, which is basically just a book focusing on psychology that is a self-help book. And it's an incredibly popular book, and it was recommended to me by somebody I really trust. So this review of that book is going to be incredibly negative and critical. So I understand that I have a hard time doing that based on the person who recommended this to me. But the book is called Type Talk at Work by Otto Kroger and Janet Thusen. I think I have that pronounced correctly. So what you'll notice right off the bat is that in Type Talk at Work, I have about 50 of these sticky notes. And in 12 Rules for Life, I have one. In the case of Type Talk at Work, in terms of its content, that's what these sticky notes are. In terms of the content of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, there wasn't much I had any disagreement with in terms of the prescriptive statements he was making, in terms of its normative claims. However, that's this pile of sticky notes, and the notes, the handwritten notes that are in the margins in Type Talk at Work are my "what are you talking about" moments. And if we could just open up to let's do 145. So on page 145, my note comes from this. The ultimate insight, of course, is the one at the very basis of type watching itself, which is what this entire book is about, type watching. There are no good or bad approaches to resolving conflicts. There are only differences. And my note is, what about violence? This is an obvious flaw in the nature and fundamental content of the book. So for me, this book was kind of garbage, and I kind of have to give it a similar rating to what I gave to Keynes. So it is a book. It is English. It isn't total gibberish. There is some sense of order, even though I completely disagree with it. And oh my God, you can see this. This page is just riddled with notes. If I'm going to give a review of this book, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 because and that's only because I'm reserving 1s and 2s for mystery science theater level bad. In the case of like a book that is like not even English or just completely disorganized and I have no idea what's even going on. So I'm going to contrast that with Jordan Peterson's book, where in terms of its content, there wasn't really anything to disagree with necessarily. It wasn't in terms of its style, and this is where we're going to get into its detractants. In terms of its style of writing, Jordan can get kind of circuitous at times, and there are times where I wish he would kind of reel things in. He's not as on the nose as some of the writers that we've read on this channel, like Soul. It's not as on the nose as the econ writers. So in those cases, what they'll do is they'll come out and say the point. Plain English, 4-letter words. This is how things are, period. Whereas Peterson will kind of fairly circuitously build towards that conclusion. And the perfect example of this is the final chapter, Rule 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. So the first page, he's talking about why the whole notion of petting a cat on the street. So if you can imagine a straight line, right? That straight line is the actual claim from Rule 12. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, right? So we get to about here, and then he veers kind of off course. And it's not until the very end that he comes back and gets back to the point. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but for me, I like stylistically books that are much more directly directed and on the nose. And quite frankly, I think he probably would have done better to attract my personal taste by making this book 20% shorter. So in terms of writing style, it's going to lose some points even within its genre for me and my personal taste, because the style isn't perfect. It's not without its flaws. And the final weakness before we get into some of the highlights you're going to see this in the reviews on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon, you go check this out, you're going to see this in the reviews, and it's real. There's an awful lot of appeal to religion. And what do I mean by appeals to religion? There's a difference between a reference to religion and an appeal to religion. And that sticky note that you guys saw is pages 224 and 225. And the reason I have that sticky note here is because on those 2 pages, we have a perfect comparison and contrast between what an appeal to religion and a reference to religion is. So on page 225, as Matthew 10:34 has it, citing Christ, emphasizing the role of the spoken truth, quote, "Think not that I have come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword," end quote. In this case, instead of referencing the biblical text, he's actually appealing to it. Now, I've given that quote complete without context, so you're going to have to just forgive me and accept that that's the case. On page 224, however, he makes a reference to the Bible or to a biblical allegory to prove the point that is separate from the actual reference. A totalitarian never asks, quote, "What if my current ambition is an error?" end quote. He treats it, instead, as the absolute. It becomes his God for all intents and purposes. It constitutes his highest value. So in this case, treating something like it is something that is not of this earth, in this case God, even if we're going to look at this from a religious believer's perspective, I think we can all accept that the God is not of this earth. So to treat something as something that is not of this earth is to treat it like a God. And even for somebody who's a devout atheist, that's just a reference to that notion. Whereas when he says, as Matthew 10:34 has it, citing Christ, he's actually appealing to that word rather than to make reference to its notions. I don't know if I have time to really get into great depth as to the specifics on what I mean by that, but especially when it comes to the coda, so there's 12 rules to life. Those are the 12 chapters of this book. There's kind of a 13th chapter. It's kind of like a half chapter, and he entitles it Coda. And basically what it is his way of explaining where 12 Rules for Life came from, and the writing process that was involved in getting from nothing to something. And that coda is just like a non-stop appeal to religion. And for me, it was just a bear to get through. I would prefer not to have that be the case. I would prefer that if he's going to make reference to religion, that's fine. If there are these allegories that are insightful, and the reason that they're insightful is because of their ancientness, and they transcend their own religion, and that's why we see them in other religious texts as a way of saying we've known something for a very long time, or as a way of saying, listen, there is this archetype, and this archetype has been in existence for a long time, and that's why it's so ingrained in our brains. That's a reference to the text, not an appeal to it. It's not you should do the thing because God said so. Right. And I think that he does too much of this is why the thing is good. God said so. And that's especially true in the coda. That's not to say the entire book is based on that. In fact, chapters 8 through 10 are pretty distinctly not wholly a-religious, and there's not even a reference to any religion in any way in those chapters. And honestly, I think those are the best chapters, but those chapters were also, and this is where the highlights come in, much less focused on the actual self-help part of the book. So the highlights of the book are the number one highlight are his personal stories. And quite frankly, if he put out, say, I don't know, a 200-page memoir of his life, I would read that in a heartbeat. I'd read that is what I'm super interested in, because his personal stories to me are the most interesting part of the book. And the next most interesting part are the insights into psychology, even though in virtually every case, it was a lot of, I kind of already know that. But I still found it kind of interesting. And then the third highlight, I would say, are actually his client stories. So when he brings up clients that he has worked with, and he doesn't give their actual names or dox them in any way, those stories, those allegories, I think are the most interesting parts of the book. So I think I've made it clear why I'm not going to give this book a perfect score, but if you are looking for a self-help book, especially if you're somebody who these pieces of advice could really help, and a lot of times it tends to be men, I can't say that I can't recommend this book. So for somebody who is extremely well adjusted and has studied psychology and really isn't interested in the genre of self-help, probably don't waste your time. Probably read a synopsis. Probably watch some Jordan Peterson videos, because those are still pretty interesting. But as far as the book is concerned, if you are not that well-adjusted, well-studied in the field of psychology person who kind of likes self-help books, this is probably as good as it's going to get. So I think the ceiling that I'm going to create over the top. So as I've mentioned, I like to close these reviews with a final score on a scale of 1 to 10. I think because of the genre and how much I kind of don't like the genre, it just doesn't interest me. It's not to my personal taste. I think a perfect score within that genre will probably be around an 8. So since this isn't perfectly adhering to my personal tastes, if it was within that genre, I'm probably going to give it either a 6 or a 7. And you know what? I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to give it a number. And the number is a very weak 7. A very, very weak 7. There's a lot of soul that I prefer to read. We are right now in the middle of reading both Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson and Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. These type of books are the books that interest me significantly more. And I would certainly give them a meaningfully higher score on a scale of 1 to 10 now than I would Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. So like I promised, I will be diving into 12 more rules for life by popular request, and I'll get a review out for that as soon as I get that finished up. And if you guys would like me to actually read it on this channel, we can do that too. So let me know in the comments section. And otherwise, thanks for sticking with me through my review of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And we will see you in the next one. Night, folks.